You are in Intersectionality panel. I am Shelbie Hugle, the Associate Dean of Admissions at BCTC, and I want to say welcome and thank you all so much for attending. I'm going to share my screen really quickly so I can introduce our two panel members. You'll get a better idea of who they are and where they're from before we get started. All right, and Jenny, I see you only, so let me know if you can see the screen. All right, awesome. I'd like to introduce our first panelist, who is Hannah Lagree, and she is the council member for the Lexington Fayette Urban County Government's 3rd District and was sworn into office in January 2021. As a council member, Hannah is a member of the General Government and Social Service and the Environmental Quality and Public Works Committee. In addition to her role on standing committees within the council, Hannah also serves on several 3rd District and LFUCG boards and commissions, including the Tree Board, Sister Cities Commission, Lexington Community Land Trust Board, and Downtown Lexington Management Board. Personally and professionally, Hannah cares deeply about education, open communication, and getting people connected. In addition to her role on the council, she works at the University of Kentucky, helping undergraduate students explore career options and learn to engage meaningful with their communities. She is the co-founder of the Lexington Film League, serves as a board member of the International Book Project, and formerly taught writing in incarcerated women through the Swallowtail Project. As a strong believer in civic engagement, she is a former board member with Civic Lex, a nonprofit organization focused on building a more participatory local democracy. In her personal life, Hannah is an avid pedestrian and bicycle commuter. She lives in the Mintel Park neighborhood where she enjoys talking with her neighbors, riding, and walking dogs with her partner Andrew. She holds a BA in English from the College of Wooster and an MA in English from the University of Kentucky. Welcome, Hannah, to our panel. Our next panelist is Miss Jeannie Williams, who is a professor of English at Hazard Community and Technical College, one of our sister colleges of the KCTCS community. Jenny Williams has been teaching writing and reading at Hazard Community and Technical College since 1992. The youngest of 6 siblings, all of whom still live in Hazard. Jenny grew up in Hazard and is deeply rooted in the community. She is the faculty advisor for HCTC, LGBTQ Plus Alliance Club. She serves on the boards of Pathfinders of Perry County and Community Farm Alliance. She is passionate about equity, food, and education. She works to change policies and behaviors so that everybody, regardless of income, age, geography, has equitable access to a good, affordable education and to fresh, healthy, local food. And she seeks to give them the tools to use both to create healthier, happier communities. So thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Hannah, for both participating today on this awesome panel. And we are ready to get started. What I'd like us to do is I have several questions that I'm going to ask our panelists. And if our audience has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat. And also feel free to raise your hand. We want you to unmute yourself and actually join some of the conversation. So let's get started. I'd like to ask both of the panelists to address what our topic is all about. So if you can both talk to us about what is intersectionality, and we'll start with Hannah.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you all for having me. I'm looking forward to having a conversation, and I hope that some of our attendees will join in, as you mentioned. Now, I'm not going to say that I am an expert on intersectionality, but I would like to start with a definition and hope that Jenny, you'll add on. I think about intersectionality as an analytical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. And this term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And it's often talked about in terms of the idea of all oppression or all advantage is linked. I think that the term was first brought forward in a paper entitled Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. And it's really worth reading that paper. But there have been many, many additional resources shared about intersectionality since that point. So hopefully that's a good starting definition. Jenny, if you want to add on to that.
Well, I'll just say that yesterday I was telling a friend of mine, I'm really excited because I get to sit on a panel about intersectionality at a conference, an LGBTQIA conference tomorrow. And she said, intersectionality, what's that? And I opened my mouth to tell her and found that I could not spout out a definition without consulting Google. So I think it's important to acknowledge that intersectionality is, I feel like maybe sometimes a little bit of a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot. And when I thought about how I might, when I mean, I really stood there with my mouth hanging open for a minute, talking to my friend, and I said, well, I think it's just really about the way that we're all connected, that who we are matters across our gender and our race and where we live and how much money we make, and that all of those things affect how we interact with the world and how the world interacts with us, and that we very often have systems in place, right, that don't recognize those things, that don't recognize how all those different parts of ourselves make us who we are. And so that's how I would define intersectionality. But I did want to say that I had to Google it. I really am not that sort of scholar. I appreciate people that are, but I think it's important to note that intersectionality is not just an academic buzzword. It's really something that we need to understand and understand deeply and live out in our lives and in the way that we recognize our fellow humans.
Jenny, I'm so glad you said that because I had to Google it as well. Because I wanted to have a better understanding of what the definition was and what it really means. And so you really touched upon our next question, which is why is it so important? And particularly in our profession in higher education. So if you want to start there, Jenny, you did touch upon some of that a little bit with why it's so important. And then Hannah, give us your perspective as well.
I have lived an incredibly privileged life all my life. Um, and I grew up here in Hazard, Kentucky in Appalachia. And so I've often seen the way that Appalachia as a region has been marginalized and misunderstood by others. And, but, you know, just when I was growing up, I didn't really think a lot about other marginalized people. But I knew that growing up in this small town and seeing the way that race differences existed, right? So in Hazard, anyway, as a privileged white kid growing up, people didn't really talk about racism or race at all. And if you asked any white person in this town, this is probably still true today, you know, do you think racism exists? They'd be like, oh, no, we all get along. Everything's great. And if you ask any black person, they would have a completely different story to tell. And so I think that understanding that where we come from and all the different things that have shaped us into who we are and that shape the way that we interact with the world, it's really important to acknowledge all of that. I so often hear, because people view Appalachia as this really monolithically white, straight, cis Christian region, and it's not that. The census data do tell the story that we do have less diversity than a lot of other areas, but because of that, I think it's really easy for people to only see one thing. And when we only see one facet of where we live or of who someone is, then we really can't move our region forward and we can't move ourselves forward. So I think it's just really easy as a white person to not see anything outside of what you see. It's really easy if I don't have to deal with you know, worrying about housing or worrying about feeding my family or worrying about a policeman. You know, I've got a son who's 24. I've never once worried that the police are going to pull him over and shoot him. But I have friends who worry about that every day. And it would be easy for me to not worry about that because it's not my own experience. But it's so important for us to think about the way that other experiences affect systems, because even if that's not my worry for my son, it's still a system that's oppressing other people and that's making this a less equitable place and a less happy, healthy place to live. And by this, I mean Appalachia, Hazard, Appalachia, Kentucky, the South, America, the world. And I think that understanding intersectionality and being able to look outside of ourselves is a really important facet of being able to understand others.
What do you think, Hannah?
Oh, I think that Jenny provided such a great kind of start into this huge question of why intersectionality is important. And Jenny, you touched on so many reasons why. You know, people's intersecting identities, their experiences, the ways in which they've moved through the world. You know, we have to take those types of kind of diversities of experience into consideration when it comes to forming policy. Jenny, I was thinking about this when your bio was shared. This idea of policy formation sometimes happens within like pretty static power systems and power systems that are built without intersecting identities in mind. And when it comes to local governance, you know, when we bring forward a piece of legislation and we're crafting policy, I try to ask, you know, who does this policy help? Who does it hurt? What are we not taking into consideration and why? And I think that some of what you're talking about is a more multifaceted approach beyond our own experiences as individuals, and trying to bring additional people and their experiences into the conversation when it comes to making laws, crafting policy, telling stories, and in education, you know, when we think about history, right? When we're talking about kind of the stories that are told within our classroom spaces, you know, I think we have to take an intersectional lens in our approach. And my hope is that in crafting policy and working with our students, as we're asking more people to be part of the conversation, that begins to shift, right? And so when we look at a governing body like City Council, which is what I'm on, you know, that's one of the reasons why it's so important to try to diversify the pipeline of candidates who are running for office, because we don't want to have a flattened approach to crafting policy and to doing our work. And oftentimes it's been easier for people with a lot of privilege or to run for office. There are all these circles when it comes to raising money and getting access to power systems that are much easier to break into when you have overlapping intersections of privilege and opportunity. And so when I think about some of the work that I do, it's like, how do we break down some of those systems so more people have more access, and intersectional approaches are essential to doing so.
Wow, you ladies hit on a lot of things that really hit home and resonate with me. I think about my 25-year-old Jenny, who I have to worry about every time he gets behind the wheel of, will he get stopped by the police, and have I equipped him enough to know what to do and how to do it appropriately so that nothing happens. And then Hannah, you talked about, you know, voting and voting rights and diversifying our political platforms. And that is so important. And then that is part of, we were sharing earlier about A Few Good Men here. It's part of one of the strategies that we are, you know, focusing on and teaching, that it is important that your vote is your voice. And that is important that you go to the polls so that you do have a voice at that particular platform. And so that really kind of dovetails into the next question that we had, since we are all in higher education, is how can we acknowledge intersectionality within our students and beyond that within our communities? So whoever wants to go first.
Jenny, you have the primary educator hat. I only wear that in part of my job, so I'll let you go first.
Well, I think that question almost answers itself. We can acknowledge it by acknowledging that it exists, by realizing and understanding that that not everybody is white, or not everybody is straight, or not everybody is cisgendered. And I feel like have been blessed with a platform to do that, because I teach writing and reading. I can use any subject matter to teach that skill set. And so I feel like it's a good opportunity, and this really gets at one of the later questions, I think a little bit more, but I feel like just sharing those stories. I think story is so important, and has been historically kind of undervalued as a way of teaching, but stories are so important, and just giving people the space to share their own stories and presenting stories to them, I think are crucial ways to teach about intersectionality. I love students always, Rosa Parks, she was tired and refused to get up off that seat. And that's not the story. The story is that she came to Appalachia. She came to Appalachia and she learned these principles of nonviolent protest in the mountains. And that link always shocks students. And I think bringing stories like that to light to help them to understand that things aren't maybe what they thought they were is a good way to recognize that and to acknowledge intersectionality in our students and in our communities.
Yeah, I agree. I think, Jenny, when I've had the opportunity to teach in some of my past roles, I've worked in higher education and in teaching and writing as I guess my primary kind of career, and moving into politics and public service has been the new thing for me. And I often think when I am forming a syllabus and when I'm putting together documents that I want to teach or stories that I want to teach, I think that diversifying the stories that we share in our classrooms, whether that's with speakers or with texts, I think that's so important, and then having conversations with our students, like once you start to talk about intersectionality and intersectional identities, it's kind of like when you realize something, what happens next? How do people get involved? And I think that intersectionality is really, really important to social equity work, right? So I think some of the activism occurring in our communities and within our community organizations are calling for much more dynamic conversations. And I think that when we're working with students, as we are approaching the classroom space with an intersectional lens, we also have to help people figure out, like, what do you do now, like, with this information, right? How do you get involved with your community or with movements that are important to you to address injustices or to change policy or to get other people involved with shaping the world that you want to live in? And I think that the classroom space is a really, really important place to begin those conversations and then to act them out in our lives beyond the classroom. But yeah, what we get to read, in school, like, really matters, and what we don't get to read, and whose voices haven't been included in the conversation, or what stories we haven't studied. It's kind of like, why? And even looking back and asking why, it's like, well, who didn't get to be published? I think that those are important questions to ask as we're thinking about even the history of whose words get shared, and what we can do to change that moving forward.
Yeah, I agree with what you both just said. I think not just the conversations, but it's the authenticity of the conversations, and people being willing to listen, and having open minds and open hearts, I think is very crucial. So, ladies, and again, to the audience, drop your questions in the chat because we do have some questions that we want to ask, but we want to make sure that we're addressing your questions as well. So if you have questions, drop them in the chat and we'll make sure that we get to those too, please. So can we address what intersections do you think are most important to realize, and what's important to pay attention to?
I read that question and I thought, well, they're all important. Who am I to say what's most important? Like,
Yeah.
where in the world do I get that power? And I realized that I do, as a privileged white person, a lot of times that power is mine, and it ought not be that way. And I think about Scott Lucero, who taught at Hazard Community and Technical College for many years, and he grew up outside of Chicago, and his father was Mexican and his mother was Polish. And I asked him once, why do you identify as Hispanic and not as Polish? And he said, well, because when I was in high school, I didn't get the crap beat out of me for being Polish. I got the crap beat out of me for being Hispanic. And I think that very often whatever part of our intersectionality is the part that is causing us to experience discrimination or inequity, that's the part we need to pay attention to, I think, because that's the part that we want to fix. That's the part that we want to address. So I don't know if that quite answers the question, but I think we need to be very careful about not privileging one facet of intersectionality over another, because to whoever's experiencing any kind of trauma or inequity or discrimination against one facet of themselves, then that facet's going to be the one that we want to pay attention to. And it's going to be different, I think, across sectors and across people.
Yes, Jenny, when I thought about that question, I had a similar reaction. You know, I at first thought, you know, when we're talking about intersectionality, we're talking about identity and experience, and I thought, well, it's not up to me or anybody else to pick and choose which aspects of identity are more important to other people. And I thought, well, I don't really get to make that decision, but I think that you have brought up a really good point. And I think sometimes when you have a platform, you sometimes do get to choose. Like whose story, like we were talking about in the classroom, right? Like whose story gets told or whose perspective gets privileged. But I think that a lot of what we're talking about also has to do with power. And when we look at, I mentioned Kimberly Crenshaw's work earlier, and I think that some of what she talks about when she's talking about intersectionality and some of the dialogue around that has to do with getting rid of or kind of deconstructing some of the existing power dynamics that are in place. So like some of what we're talking about is like, how can we use this kind of tool of intersectional identity and recognizing it, bringing in other people's perspectives and listening to them, and to challenge the structures that undergird our politics, our law, our culture. And I think that you're right that like prioritizing one aspect over another does not accomplish that goal. But oftentimes people, when they move through the world, are apprehended in a way so that there's just like one part of them that's seen. And I think what we're trying to do when we're talking about intersectionality is recognize that multifaceted way in which all of these identities overlap with each other to create, again, these systems of power or privilege or oppression, and then go from there. So that's a tough question, Shelbie. I mean, because
it was a very complex question, but these questions actually came from our student group, which I think is very awesome. These are some things that they wanted to hear you all address. So yes, it wasn't a tough question for me. It was a tough question from our students. So I do see a hand raised. Hannah, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Hi, yes. I've had a question kind of in regards to this topic. I know that a lot of times, like that power dynamic and the privilege identity can almost take, um, I don't know how to word this right, but I'm thinking along the lines of like white feminism, like kind of using that your privilege identity as a springboard for those conversations, but shutting out the more marginalized identities in the process, if that makes sense. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that dynamic, if that makes sense.
I had a little bit of a hard time hearing, but I think the question was about this like white feminist identity. Is that right? Can I
Yeah, sorry, I don't know. It might be my microphone. Is that a little better?
It's a little bit better.
Okay.
Can you speak a little louder, Hannah? A little louder.
Yes. I guess my question is like for individuals that might have a more privileged identity in that intersection. So like speaking of like white feminists, where the more marginalized identity is identifying as a woman, but you also have the white privilege intersecting with that, kind of how they might use that power to almost like put down the more marginalized individuals. So like I think about like the Black feminist movement and how that has kind of been put on the back burner in regards to the more white feminist movement. Or like I see it in like the LGBT community, like the white, maybe the white heterosexual people have more power in that dynamic as opposed to like Black trans folk.
Yeah.
Did Hannah, or you're on
I
mute,
didn't know if
Jenny?
I was watching Jenny's mouth to see if she was going to speak. I mean, Hannah, I guess I honestly thought about this when I looked at our panel. You know, I thought I was like, you know, am I taking up space, right, where someone else could be speaking? You know, and I think that what sounds like some of what you're asking has to do with how do we share resources and how do we make sure that movements aren't monolithic, or they're not overtaken by people with certain identities or access, and that they're not also co-opted. I mean, Jenny, what do you think? What are some of your thoughts about this question?
I think it's a constant danger. It's for me personally, you know, it's really hard for me to shut the hell up and sit down and let somebody else speak sometimes. As the youngest, I'm the youngest. I'm a classic like youngest child, right, of all these siblings. And I think that we often, I thought the same thing, Hannah, when I was like, why are these two white chicks on this panel? What's up with that? You know, but I do think there's a danger that we ignore or shout out other voices, and that we don't invite those voices in. In our town, we've been working to get a fairness ordinance passed, and I feel so strongly about this. I really want it to happen. And it's been personally a little bit difficult for me to, as I've gotten older, it's gotten easier. But when I was younger, it was really hard for me to sort of step back and let the people who are being affected do the speaking, and to support them, to just sit down and shut up and let other people speak. I do think that's a constant danger that we run into. And I do think that we can run the risk of oppressing people by not doing it. And I think it's important to make room for those spaces, and to, and make room for those voices, and to realize they're not always going to sound like ours, right? That they're not going to go about it in the same way that we might. I just yesterday, I hope no one is on this conference from our high school, but the high school my daughter attends had a Black History Month panel, and I was kind of watching some of it, and there's a young man who I've known since he was a little boy. He's an amazing musician. He has a beautiful voice, and he's saying a change is going to come. But I thought, why is Landon doing this? I know that why is this white kid playing the piano and singing this song when I know how many amazing Black voices are in that high school? And I don't know still who planned that, or whose idea that was, or why someone else wasn't given a little bit more of a spotlight there. But I think it's something we have to constantly guard against. I know that that's not an answer, but it's an acknowledgement that I know that I've probably been a participatory member in not shutting up when I should.
Yeah. I agree. I sometimes think about, like, Jenny, when you were saying that when other people are giving input or other movements are happening, or, you know, I often think about this in the space of council. With council, there are certain ways to give public input. Okay, so you can email your council member, you can call them on the phone, or you can come to council chambers and give input there. And the space of council chambers is very intimidating. and it's very formal, and it's very, very structured. And all of the council members sit up on what we call the horseshoe, or elevated on a platform. And then if you want to speak, you have to speak at a certain time in the meeting, and sometimes you have to sit through like hours of these meetings in order to speak, and then you've got to sign in to speak, and then the mayor calls you up, and then you only have 3 minutes to talk, and there's like you have to introduce yourself in a certain way, and sometimes there are people who come to speak and they've never done this before, and they're really, really nervous, and it's like interacting with this like physical embodiment of like a power structure, right? And I often think like we've got to find a way to make this easier, to make it so that more voices can come into the conversation, and to do it in a dialogue. And I think that as a public servant, that should always be one of the goals. Like, not always expecting people to come to you and share their experiences and their input, but for you to go into other people's space and sometimes just be quiet and think like, this is not my space, but I'm here so that I can learn and understand. And sometimes I need to be asked into that space, and sometimes I need to reach out. But I often think about that when we think, well, okay, this is the way we receive public input. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. And to me, that's connected with some of your question. So that's what came to mind. Thanks for your question, Hannah.
Yes,
Oh,
Hannah.
thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you. That was an excellent question. I really do appreciate you asking. And if there are any others, please raise your hand so I can call on you. That was a great question. Um, so if we don't have another hand raised, we'll go ahead with another question, which is, we touched upon this too as well, Jenny and Hannah, just looking at how do you specifically emphasize intersectionality in your work on your day-to-day? How do you emphasize that?
I think you're right. We started to touch on this a little bit. And I think that what I was trying to get at a bit in my last answer was like, again, I think we know that the voices of people who have been most marginalized are often silenced. And I think, to return to my previous question, I try to ask is like, when we're putting forward legislation, we have to always be thinking about, and sometimes reaching out and asking to get other perspectives, hopefully more often than not, when we're putting forward legislation, who does this affect? Who does this help or hurt? And who needs to be included in this conversation? And how do we work harder to bring in more people with more perspectives as we are crafting policy or legislation? And then I think that some of what I was trying to also talk about previously was like our use of language, what all this has to do with language and access and the use of power structures, and kind of trying to break those power structures down for the betterment of more people. And I think, a big part of my role as a public servant, I've tried to ask, like, if you see a power imbalance, what next? Like, what do you do when you see something that needs to be changed? And I think intersectionality is part of that process. And sometimes that can be very uncomfortable if the current systems of power and privilege benefit you, right? And so when we're talking about policies to fight racism, for example, we have to also examine other forms of prejudice when kind of going through the policy crafting process. And I think that some of the big difficult questions that come up when people start to approach things with an intersectional lens cause people to be feel unprepared or they're unwilling to answer them. And so that's kind of, I think, my goal is like when big questions come up, when realizations occur, when new perspectives are entered into the conversation, then we have to say like, hey, this is a really wicked issue that we want to deal with. And by wicked, I mean, sticky or multifaceted. And it's going to take a lot of people changing the way things are done now in order to craft policy or legislation that positively affects more people. So I guess that's kind of when I think about intersectionality in my work, that's what comes to mind for me.
Jenny, do you have some comments?
I'll just say real quickly that, like I said, I think story is very important, and it's always, I feel a constant tension between doing things that are just performative and things that actually create change. And what I'm about to say may be strictly performative, but I'm the advisor of the HCTC LGBTQ plus Alliance Club, and I always feel a little fraudulent when I say that because the club's pretty inactive. Especially since COVID with not having students. But I feel strongly and feel supported by Dr. Linden, our president, in this notion that if we do nothing else but exist, so that a student who looks at student clubs on our website sees that we exist, then we're sending a really powerful message of acceptance out to our community, to potential students, and to just members of the community. And so I think just trying to acknowledge that I see other things in every way that I can in my teaching and my community work and my volunteerism. I try to always be really mindful of the way that marginalized groups may be present.
Thank you, Jenny, for that. Let's see, Lori, I think you've put something in the chat. Let's see if there's a question there. Authentic conversations are so necessary. Lori, you're a talker. Do you want to just come off mute? I know Lori very well. And ask your question, or do you want me to say it?
Shelbie, I won't make you read it. I'll ask it. We see what's happening around the country with legislation, and the question that I put in the chat is authentic conversations are so important, and we do often get to choose to deconstruct power openly with no retaliation in the classroom. But what we're seeing, like with House Bill 1577 in Florida, with dubbed "Don't Say Gay" legislation that has passed the House. And how do we continue to encourage our students in the classroom to advocate for each other and to advocate for change when the conversation itself is demonized by the legislation that we see passed across the country? It's disturbing. It's always been disturbing, but I think our students they're seeing this now more than ever because they didn't live through the previous generation of disturbing. Now they're seeing this new generation of disturbing. So any ideas how educators can continue that conversation when legislation itself is being passed to say, don't have the conversation?
No, but if you figure it out, I sure would like to hear your answer, because that's so horrifying. I think that we all probably got a little maybe a little complacent about the advances that we've made, and seeing them chipped away at now is frankly disheartening and horrifying. And it's I can't imagine how horrifying it would be to someone whose rights are going to be much more impacted than mine would. So I don't know the answer to that. I think just making students aware of it. Pulling up articles, having them read about it, having them think about it, having them talk about it, and having them find. For me, it's often been a challenge because in spite of what I say about how diverse and rich a culture Appalachia is, the truth is I rarely have students of color or students who are openly LGBTQ in my classroom. And so a lot of times I feel like I'm teaching to people who haven't had to think about this before, or who are openly hostile against the idea of intersectionality and of being open to other ideas. And it's I think when we think about intersectionality, I think sometimes it's useful to think about where we can find those places that are similar, right? So I think about the Poor People's Campaign, especially, and like, how in the world did we get like poor white people and black people pitted against each other? Like, who was the marketing genius that made that happen back in the day? Because they're fighting against the same systems of oppression, and finding a way to let students see that, to see that just because you're not gay, or just because you're not trans, or just because you're not black, that doesn't mean that your rights are not being impacted by these other structures that are taking away those rights from other people. So I don't know the answer to that. It's really horrifying to me what's happening. And I guess just keep, those of us who have the privilege to keep hollering about it can just keep hollering, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with Jenny. I think that sometimes this goes beyond your question, or it's in addition to your question. I think that sometimes when people see legislation passed that's so discriminatory in other places, it makes them feel hopeless. And that's the opposite of how we want people to feel. We want people to feel mobilized. We want more people to get into office and be activated. And sometimes that change or that activation is more accessible on a local level, right? So like to run for city council, or to get involved with a local campaign, or to get behind a candidate whose values you believe in, I think that's teaching our students about the way kind of legislation works, about how their voices can be part of the conversation, about how they could run for office, about how they can be politically activated. I think that is another part of this conversation, so that we can get more people in office and mobilized, so that this type of legislation doesn't move forward in the future. And so that's I think, I don't want to kind of replicate what Jenny says, but I think I agree with her, and that's my addition to her statement.
Thank you both. Those are really great answers, and sometimes we just need to hear those as educators to encourage us to continue doing what we're doing in the classroom. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori, for asking that question. It was a great question. We have a couple more questions on our list, and we have about 10 more minutes in our session, so I want to make sure I get the audience questions too. So drop it in the chat or raise your hand again. But here's another question, is how does sexuality relate to home, work, and family?
I guess it depends on your own experience. It's hard for me to generalize. I think it's hard for me to generalize how sexuality impacts the kind of intimate aspects of other people's personal lives. But when I think about my own, I guess, experience and my sexuality and my identification as part of the LGBTQ plus community, I think it helps me realize that people have complex identities, and we don't always see their identities. There's a lot of people's experiences that we don't know about just from apprehending them on the surface. And I think that's really, really important to remember as we move through the world. I think it's so easy to make assumptions about people and say, okay, this is this person, and to categorize them quickly. And I think that some of our conversation today has been very much about recognizing complexity and trying to openly be curious about it and engage with it. And also, that's a personal decision for people if they want to share their identities, if they want to talk about kind of their intersectional experiences or their sexuality as part of that. But I'm often reminded that there's so much that people carry with them. And I think sexuality can be part of that equation.
Any thoughts, Jenny?
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. I read that question and I thought, how does it not affect? Like, how does it's who we are? And if we can't be who we are in the places where we live, then we can't be very productive human beings, I don't think.
I agree. I agree. When I read that too, I thought, well, I wonder what other kind of unique answer they're going to
Shelbie.
Okay. So our last question, how does inequality manifest in the classroom? And particularly as it relates to the LGBTQ population.
I think this is a really interesting question, and I think it's interesting to think about how the prevalence of virtual education has changed this answer. So back in the olden days, when I had actual students in front of me in a classroom, I was always, I've set policies sort of at the beginning of the semester that my classroom was a safe space, and that, you might look around, you might be able to see what color people are, but you aren't able to see a lot of other things about them, and that you should, not make assumptions, and that it was fine to disagree, but that we had to do so in a manner that was respectful and that wasn't denigrating, and that there were things that we wouldn't tolerate in class. And I was able to sort of set a tone real early on, usually the very first day and usually the first couple of classes, to make sure that that was true. And then, you kind of find students out, especially in a writing class, because they often write about very personal things. And I was able to talk to students in person and say, hey, thank you for sharing that with me. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Or if you need a safe space to talk about this, that would be great. This is getting away from that question. I really never had much problem with having to shut people down, but I had colleagues who've talked about that, about how there'll be, that one person in the class who's kind of a bully, who sort of makes it uncomfortable for other people to talk about things. And I know that that has happened. I think now that we're in a more virtual space, I'm curious about how that makes people feel about sharing things about themselves or about being marginalized. My own experience, I'm feeling real gloomy this week, having taught 2 classes where I'm just looking at, these gray silhouettes. Our broadband in Eastern Kentucky is so bad, I can't even require my students to turn on their cameras and their microphones, let alone ask them to participate. And so I think that that it's going to be interesting to see how moving into this new world is going to change when we look at at equity. But I will say this, I think that poverty often does not make space for equity. So when I look at Eastern Kentucky and I look at my students, and a lot of them are choosing online classes because they don't have any other choice. But a lot of them are choosing online classes because, frankly, they don't have the money to pay for gas to drive across the county to get here. But they've got these horrible internet connections at home, so they're having a really hard time sort of keying in that way. And I think that poverty and the lack of resources is going to be causing a lot of inequity as we move forward and start to access more things virtually. And I hope that we can make that space a more equitable space, but so far I'm not seeing it, frankly.
All good points. In my other role in my life, I'm a career counselor, and part of your question, I think, was how does inequity or how does it manifest in the classroom and the workplace? And I think I talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's, some of this is, it's kind of like who gets more space to talk, who gets included over and over again. Again, to talk about power structures, just like people, some of what we're talking about is like mentorship or access. And Jenny, you were talking about this in terms of poverty too. I mean, some of our challenge is the cost of higher education, how expensive it can be to go to school. And then beyond that, like thinking about moving into the workplace, like all of these like norms that people are asked to perform sometimes in order to move toward what we talk about as normative ideas of success, right? Like ways to dress, ways to talk, who to talk to, spaces to enter into, who takes notice of you and mentors you and helps connect you, and like networking, like all of this, I mean, is about, you know, power and privilege sometimes. And so, again, I think those of us, you know, who have more access, it's our responsibility to generate more access. And so, and to check our own biases of like, who do we mentor? You know, like, and who do we encourage to get into a certain field, or encourage to take classes, or encourage to be a part of whatever we get to kind of be involved with in the classroom. Making sure that more people have a voice in many ways is so important. So those are some of the things that come to mind for me, I think, in both of my roles, you know. And then it's like what we talked about before, like, how do we change some of those norms?
Exactly. Thank you, Hannah and Jenny. I thought, oh my gosh, are we going to have 55 minutes worth of conversation? And we truly have. I think we have time for maybe one more question if someone has a question, because we are right at 2 more minutes. Anyone? Anyone? I really do appreciate, Jenny, you and Hannah being here. I've learned so much. I appreciate you being advocates for these populations of students in our community. Clearly, through your bios, you guys serve our communities well, your communities well. And I appreciate you being here at our conference. For those who joined us late, I did drop the survey in our chat. So please make sure that you fill that out today, if you could. And if there's not anything else, I want to thank you all again so much for coming. One last chance. Anyone have a question, a burning question that you're just dying to ask? Well, I'm looking at Erin, our interpreter. She was paused. All right. Hearing none, thank you all again so much. And I think we're ready to hear our lunch speaker, if you all want to join them. Jenny and Hannah, I appreciate it. Reach out anytime if you have anything that you would like me to assist you with. I would be more than happy to do that.
Thank you. Somebody asked if you could reshare the survey.
Oh, okay. I most certainly can. I will
Thanks,
do that.
everybody.
Thank
I
you
will
so
drop
much,
it back in the
everyone.
chat.
Thank you,
Thank
Shelbie.
you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Jenny.
Erin.